As someone that came up through the 1980s and 90s, I easily recognized that Capcom was often associated with some of the best games I played. From my earliest memories of the arcade, Capcom was there. When the NES showed up, Capcom was there. And even when Sega introduced its brand new 16-bit platform to North America in 1989, one of the first games I saw for it was, you guessed it, a Capcom game. In this episode, we will be looking at the games Capcom was responsible for on the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. While Capcom was responsible for the creation of all these properties originally, they weren't always the ones doing the actual port. I hope you guys enjoy Capcom and the Sega Genesis. It may surprise some of you, but the first game Capcom developed in-house for the Sega Genesis was actually the 1993 release, Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. As the story goes, they even tried to outsource this project initially, but the work had gone so badly they decided to bring the project in-house and do it themselves. This is a combination of the arcade content from both Street Fighter II Champion Edition and Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, melded into one package that can be made to play like either one. The quality of the visuals overall are quite nice, with great color use that doesn't dither the screen all to hell. The backgrounds do lose some animations here and there, but I think Capcom did an excellent job here. I also think they nailed the music in this release. Each song is represented well, and I really think it did the arcade originals justice. The one area though where Capcom really dropped the ball were the voice samples. They are scratchy and not particularly well done. Compared to other 16-bit home versions of the game, it's by far the worst in this category. There is a modern fan hack that fixes this somewhat and gets it sounding a whole lot better and is highly recommended. It was developed simultaneously with the 6-button pad for the Sega Genesis, a design so well received it would go on to inspire the creation of the great Sega Saturn controller. Capcom also did the follow-up, Super Street Fighter II The New Challengers in-house the following year. This was a straight port of the arcade original, and once again Capcom did an excellent job on the visual side of things. Every stage looks fantastic for hardware that can only display 64 colors at a time. And while the animation does again take a few hits in certain areas, it's still incredibly well done. It also plays really fast and doesn't miss a beat, pumping out your projectiles, combos, and other special attacks. As much as I want to swing from Capcom's sack here, I still have to mention that I feel that the music takes an overall nosedive. While I enjoyed the previous game's take on the arcade tracks, these new renditions sound anemic with lower volume and an overall weaker presence. It simply doesn't sound as good, and of course, the scratchy voice samples make a return. There is a fan fix for this one as well that makes things better, but it's a shame Capcom couldn't get it done themselves given the extra time and massive size of the cartridge, which came in at a whopping 40 megs.
Round 2, fight!
Also in 1994 was Mega Man The Wily Wars, which was a compilation of the first 3 Mega Man games wrapped up into one story that included a new area called the Wily Tower that gave you a final conclusion. Capcom outsourced the development of this one to a small company called Minakuchi Engineering, though they did publish it in both Japan and Europe themselves. It was never released physically in North America, but was released temporarily as a Sega Channel exclusive. The visual presentation here has seen a mild upgrade throughout. The color is a bit better, the shading a bit better, and there are instances of additional effects like parallax scrolling that weren't present in the originals. As expected, the major differences in sound hardware has this version sounding quite a bit different from the NES original. I like some of it, but it does at times lack the consistent quality of its source. I wouldn't call it bad, but if you are a diehard fan of the original, the change here can seem jarring, particularly if you aren't accustomed to the FM-generated sound of the Genesis. There's also some rough slowdown that creeps in often, particularly against the bigger and stronger enemies. It's available on the Sega Genesis Mini as well. (1994) also saw Capcom release perhaps its most interesting non-Street Fighter product on the Genesis, Saturday Night Slam Masters. Capcom, being no stranger to fighting games and beat-em-ups at this point, decided to blend the two in an over-the-top wrestling game featuring colorful characters and some crazy action. The wrestlers are named stuff like Biff Slamkovich and King Rostamon, and even Mike Hagar from Final Fight is here. Each of these guys have their own moves and special attacks, and there is a Genesis exclusive deathmatch option that basically makes the ring a booby-trapped weapon of death. The gameplay is a mix of beat-em-up and wrestling mechanics, and it shares a look and feel with Final Fight beyond just a character. The matches don't last long, it's hard, and it certainly takes a hit with the lack of tag team play, but it's still pretty fun. Sega wasn't the only video game maker with a license to make Disney content. Capcom had done it a number of times themselves, and the Genesis got the Great Circus Mystery starring Mickey and Minnie in 1994. Your friends have disappeared while at the circus, and it's up to you to find them. The first thing you are likely to do is compare this directly to the Sega-made Mickey games like Castle and World of Illusion. There is no comparison there. The polished and finely tuned gameplay of the Sega software is better than this in every single way. But don't let that put you off, this is still not a bad experience overall. The visuals are quite nice with lots of detail in the enemies and set pieces, and there is even a bit of exploration across its uniquely themed levels. You usually get a new suit that bestows new abilities quite often, offering a variety rarely seen in platformers of the time. It's got 2-player simultaneous co-op, making it a great one to play with your kids. This was actually a sequel to the Super Nintendo game, The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse, but since the Genesis didn't get a port of that, the Magical Quest 2 part was stripped from the title. Shockingly, despite the popularity of these games on Sega platforms, there was never a European release of this for the Mega Drive. In 1995, Capcom outsourced a port of the arcade beat-em-up The Punisher for the Sega Genesis. It was done by Sculptured Software, and is the only port of this game in existence. Despite the arcade being held in relative high regard, the Genesis port left much to be desired. The music sucked, it's censored, and there are loads of visual cutbacks across color, animations, and set pieces, and perhaps worst of all, there are actually missing enemies and moves. It even feels different in the gameplay department. Believe it or not, they actually tried to fit this game on a 16 meg cart. which is hilarious when you think about the older Street Fighter II game using a 24 meg cart and Saturday Night Slam Masters using the same. It's still a fun game with a friend, and it does capture a small piece of what made the arcade version great. You still get lots of weapons, some great boss fights, and of course the 2-player co-op. Capcom must have had zero confidence in its sales potential. It limited the cartridge size when so many other Genesis games were bigger. It sold extremely poor at retail in both the US and Europe, resulting in modern-day collector prices in the hundreds of dollars for a complete copy. I've often heard Super Nintendo fans exclaim that this would have been better if it were on that system. I actually happen to agree, not because of any lacking ability on the Genesis part, but because Capcom would have done it themselves and the resulting quality would have likely been far higher. You may be asking yourself at this point, what about the other Capcom games that were released on the Genesis? Well, none of those actually had anything to do with Capcom other than being licensed out for other companies to handle. The following games were developed by Sega themselves, with absolutely no help from Capcom other than the license. The first of these was Ghouls 'n Ghosts, which Sega handled in-house themselves and published in 1989. They needed a showpiece for their new hardware, and this game had just been released in the arcade less than a year prior. Sega largely succeeded too, nailing the overall look and feel of the Source exceptionally well. I mean, you can nitpick it in side-by-side comparisons, but it's remarkable considering the gulf between the two pieces of hardware they were on. Even more to the point of just how good this turned out, it's running on a mere 5 megs of ROM. A tiny amount for such a conversion. Even the tiny credit card size Super Graphics version was much larger at 8 megs. Sega also developed and published Forgotten Worlds on the Genesis in 1989. This was a multi-directional shoot-'em-up that was based on the original Capcom arcade version. The cart for this one is even smaller, forcing major cutbacks to much of the background detail, but the action remains intact here, including the store where you can buy power-ups and such. The 2-player co-op is still here as well. It was Capcom's Strider that made the biggest impact for Sega in 1990. This was the first 8 meg cart for the platform, and it was again handled in-house by Sega themselves. Heavily advertised as a killer app for months before its release, this port of the popular arcade game was extremely well received by gamers and critics alike. Despite some of the differences in speed and audio, it was a strong showing for the Genesis and what it was capable of doing. I mean, again, you can nitpick the hell out of it in side-by-side comparisons, but this had only been released the year before in the arcade, on vastly superior hardware. The fact that it was this close at all is absolutely amazing. Sega switched up genres a bit when they developed their own version of Mercs for the Genesis in 1991. This overhead shoot-'em-up has been butchered in a number of ways. The 3-player co-op is completely gone and is now only single player. The visuals are far simpler as well. To make up for this, Sega actually developed an entirely new game in addition to the port itself. This new content is entirely different, adds additional characters, and even allows you to buy power-ups and items from stores. So basically you're getting 2 games in one. The lack of multiplayer still hurts, but this game is still quite playable. Sega's final product that used a Capcom license was also the worst named game on the system. 1992's Chiki Chiki Boys had no hope of selling well with that name and its box art. The game revolves around two young twins fighting to get their land back after an evil monster moved in and took over. And here's the thing, this actually isn't a bad game at all. Stages can be played randomly, there's a variety of gameplay types, and a visual style that does the arcade version on which it's based proud. In fact, this is one of those games many of you would likely look right past thinking it was crap, but this has merits that make it very much worth playing. Doubly so if you have a friend in tow. It puts you in mind of the adventure-based Wonder Boy titles, and that's not a bad thing at all. It's easy to simply lump all of Capcom's properties under one banner and move on. Like a lot of the things in gaming, the truth is that it's much more complicated than that. Before Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition, Capcom wanted nothing to do with Sega or its systems. In fact, even the properties that Sega licensed, Capcom offered no help, assets, or development advice on how to get the job done. Of the handful of titles Capcom would publish, they outsourced 2 of them to companies that, and let's be kind here, weren't exactly known as top-tier software developers. There are so many titles that could have been done well on Sega's Genesis had Capcom been there from the beginning, doing things in-house and putting a proper budget and team behind it. I mean, if a fan-made version of Mega Man X can look, sound, and play like this on the Genesis, surely Capcom could have done a decent job themselves. Hell, even the 2 Street Fighter games have fan-made color and sound hacks that make them better overall experiences. While Capcom made Sega fans proud on the Saturn and Dreamcast, you kinda have to roll your eyes at their overall lack of effort here. Nintendo was clearly their priority even after Capcom had the freedom from contracts to do what they wanted, and Genesis and Mega Drive fans kinda got the shaft in terms of quantity. Had it not been for Sega and their excellent 16-bit licensed efforts, Capcom's name wouldn't be nearly as well spoken of on the Genesis and Mega Drive platform. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.